Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest is Ken Harding, owner and proprietor of St. Louis School of Arms in St. Louis, Missouri. Ken has been practicing martial arts for almost 40 years and has been practicing Western martial arts for over a decade, exclusively teaching the Bolognese system. Ken, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, you have an amazingly extensive martial arts background. Tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in the Bolognese system.
Okay. Well, I don't know if it's amazing. It's just something I begun and never stopped. I didn't even start very young. I wasn't a kid when I got involved. I was right out of high school. I graduated class 3. So right around 84, probably 84, 85. I got involved with Japanese martial arts, heavily um, heavy emphasis on weapons in addition to grappling and open hand. And it's just something I always wanted to get into, but never got involved in when I was a kid. Took it up on myself to get involved in it and just kept up at it. Enjoyed it. And even when my own teacher had to leave town after a few years, I didn't want to stop. So I, out of necessity, became a teacher and created my own training partners. I recruited anybody I could. I taught in my basement, in my backyard, and within a few years, I had a small following of maybe 10 or a dozen people. And so, by about the time it was 1991 when I opened an actual commercial brick and mortar martial arts school. I was 26, and it was quite a leap diving right into that, and a lot of responsibility to take up. That was right at the exact same time my first son was born, and I taught full time and kept that up for 15 straight years. Um,
That's pretty incredible. I mean, just thinking of from perspective of um, being involved in overall just the running of a school. Um, how are I- 15 years is a long time, and even running now with the St. Louis School of Arms, you've, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, how were you able to do that?
well, I had it wasn't a big affair. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on how you did it. I wanted to do it with honesty. I never used. It didn't seem like a big commercial endeavor. I didn't have the contracts and all that high pressure stuff. I figure if people liked what they were doing, they would come back. So I didn't tie people down into it. I think I got up to around 90 students or so. Um, and I taught a lot of private lessons. If you're wanting to know how do you keep this thing running, how do you make a living off of it, you have to teach a lot. You have to teach a lot of private lessons. And I taught probably 3 a day, hour-long private lessons throughout the day, Monday through Friday. And I've stayed pretty booked for the majority of that 15 years. So I taught out of a warehouse space, which was wonderfully low overhead. So just your basic concrete walls, high ceiling, garage door type of warehouse space. Um, and so the overhead low, my expenses were low. I was able to, for 15 years, um, and the economy was in such a place where it permitted something like that. People had disposable income in the 90s. And it was a, as they say, it's a good gig if you can get it. And I enjoyed it. And uh, things did change around 2000, around the time of the 9/11. 9/11, the economy took a downturn. Things became kind of scary. People became a little more nervous. People were a little more cautious about their disposable income. And so um, I started to look into, well, I might need to do something else or supplement this or make a change. Um, so when you're doing a martial arts school yourself and you've got to get your own health insurance for your family, these things take precedence. And so around about the middle of, I was around 2004, 2005, um, I started looking into going back to school. So while I was teaching, I went to college and I got a bachelor's in network engineering. So in 2006, I stepped away and handed off my operations to my students. And then I got into the IT field and did that for a good decade, more than a decade, 12, 11 or 12 years. I still taught though. I never quit martial arts, no matter what else I was doing. I always taught. I had people who would come back to me and say, "Can you teach us something? Can you give us small lessons? We're getting a little group together. We have two or three or four guys. Please come and teach us. We even will get you a place." And so that's how I actually wound up finding the place I'm in now. Is previous students recommended it, and I would just on a Saturday or a Sunday teach a class pretty steadily throughout the years when I was in the IT field. Um, but what happened that was significant was around 2010 or so. I heard of this thing called HEMA. Now, it's what's important to know is that, especially in the 80s and the 90s, in the Japanese realm of martial arts, in the Asian circles, we didn't think much highly of the European style. Basically, we thought it was a myth, joke, basically non-existent. If you were to ask us, what did the Europeans do with a sword? Well, I'd probably say they bludgeoned you with it. It was not even a sharp sword. They had to lower people in armor with cranes onto their horses. It was, of course, all hearsay, misinformation, things gotten from movies, and well, in the absence of correct information, in the vacuum of correct information, anything will do. And so, yeah, there was this attitude among the teachers with a Japanese katana that, of course, this is the superior sword, and nothing else is worth talking about or worth doing. But when I heard that, well, there really was this movement to reconstruct the forgotten fighting systems of Europe, and based on real sources, it's based on the actual writings of the people who did it at the time. Now, that was very interesting to me. I was fascinated by that. I thought that was marvelous, and I felt it was something I wanted to get involved with. Now, having done what I had done for quite a number of years, I didn't feel like I had gone as far as I could go. I didn't feel like I had mastered everything, but I didn't feel I was making as much of a contribution anymore as I could be. And I really saw this new thing as something that I could make a contribution to. Um,
Mm.
and, number one, it was interesting to me, and number two, I could help. I thought I could be of use. It's uncharted territory.
Yeah. And so before you were doing jujitsu?
I was doing well, bojutsu, jojutsu, really jujitsu in the realm of Budo, really all things to do with weapons, quite a range, spears, naginata, of course, swords of various lengths, one-handed, the small sword, long sword, tanto, the knife. Um, and so I was used to um, doing a lot of different weapons. I had a wide arsenal. And so it wasn't difficult for me to juggle, not literally, but figuratively juggle.
Yeah.
And so that intrigued me too, because as I picked up the fact that that also was the case in HEMA, it wasn't simply a matter of um, just a sword, but there was an opportunity to involve yourself in a variety of weapons. That was interesting to me. Now, initially, I did sort of dabble or explore various options. I mean, the HEMA realm is quite vast. And so I didn't know exactly where I would land. So I looked into German, the longsword. I looked at rapier, just to sort of sample and to sort of find my niche. Now I came upon people doing bolognese, and this would have been around 2013, 2014. I don't know, somewhere in there. And I liked the look of it. Number one, I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was artistic. It caught my eye right away as it being elegant. And when I looked further into it, I realized, well, unlike some of the other varieties of HEMA, there's a lot of material. There are plays. It's not just a small core set of basic master cuts or techniques. It was actually plays, and not just a few of them. It was hundreds of them. This vast catalog of historical material that appealed to me. And it may have something to do with a similarity to the Japanese structure of teaching through kata, a structured play. Um, that method of transmission I find appealing. So I got involved with the Bolognese methodology. I located who I thought um, sort of matched my own thoughts, my own movement theory, my own um, um, who seemed most like me. And I noticed up in Chicago, they had the Chicago Swordplay Guild, and Robert Rutherford does a marvelous job with the Bolognese method. And I contacted Greg Melee, and I went up there and went to one of their workshops, invited them down a few times uh, in the next couple of years to St. Louis, and had them do workshops to sort of put down the initial bricks. Um, and then after that, I just took off. And my student base began to grow. And so it was around, let's say, about 3 years ago, I was able to make the choice, can I return to doing this full time again? And I was able to, and I made that leap again into becoming a full time teacher.
Yeah.
That's where I am. That's where I am today.
And you're prodigious. I mean, you've produced so much material. A lot of times when I encounter new students of the Bolognese system, 5 or 6 years ago, the person who they would always point to would be Ilka. And now the person that I hear the most, the person whose name I hear the most is your name. I mean, most of the people that I encounter who's coming, come in now, they've encountered you on YouTube, or the various other channels that you distribute through, like Venmo or not Venmo. What is it? I can't remember the name of that one streaming platform. Vimeo, that's what it is. Yeah, yeah, and of course your Patreon channel.
Well, and that really only came about because of COVID.
Yeah,
I was forced to shut down for 6 weeks due to a stay-at-home order here in St. Louis, and a few people just had to step back and stay home and didn't feel like coming back in even when we reopened. So there was an impact to COVID on the school, and bearing in mind that this is my job, this is my profession,
yeah,
had to do something to supplement that. So really, that was a response to COVID. I need to supplement the physical school with basically what is a virtual school. So I'm gratified to hear that, and I hope I deserve that from these people. I'm trying to do my best in presenting the material as I see it, as as my best honest attempt.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I think you are. I really do. I think, as a patron of the art, as somebody that it sort of stands as a pillar that a lot of people build their foundation off of. I think you do a fantastic job, and I think that's the general consensus that I've gotten from a lot of the community. Um, you know, Obviously, uh, the way that people interpret texts and when they come up with their own interpretations, which is always great. It's always great to see different ideas, but
Mhm.
um, you know, whether they agree or disagree with your interpretations, there's still the idea that you're producing that and starting those discussions and encouraging people to have those discussions, which I think is
Yeah,
incredibly valuable.
sure.
Um,
Yeah, the way that I look at things now is definitely not the way I looked at things 6, 7, 8 years ago. It's just not the case.
yeah.
The first time I cracked open a book, well, I took a stab at it figuratively. But now, I am very systematized. I have my interpretations, and of course they're still subject to change. Everything is still a working model. But now a lot more has to take place for me to go through that process of change, because I do put a lot of time into it. And you have to understand that I will approach an interpretation, and I will work through it, first of all, just in my own head and on paper, but then I'll work through it with a small group of individuals. I'll then work through that with a large class. And for me, creating an interpretation isn't something that I throw together in 15 minutes or half an hour. For me, it's really a process that takes at minimum a few weeks to maybe a month longer, and really is an open-ended process. I've got some examples where I'm still working on interpretations after 6, 7 years, and I'm still finding myself changing. And what makes them, of course, the most impact is, well, now that I've read all the works of all the masters, read them, but done practically all of them physically, well, that makes the biggest difference. Going back
Yeah.
literally after years of, well, now that I've done, all of the one-handed, the sword and buckler, the two-handed, the sword and targa, the rotella and the dagger and the pole arms and all of these things, effective to some degree, that forced me to rethink how I perceived these things years earlier.
Yeah, you kind of get an idea of the complete system versus just the individual technique. Sometimes you don't quite see the forest through the trees when you're just looking at, when you've got a tree right in your face and it's just the technique that you're working on. But when you can actually understand the complexity of the entire system, especially like you said, since you've read all of the books of all the masters, and I mean, it's obvious through the amount of material that you've put out, that you've been through you know
Mhm.
most of them, and you have interpretations available for people to look at for almost all the different masters.
Yeah.
But you get that feeling of, this is the Bolognese system.
Mhm.
This is how you approach the fight, and this is how you proceed with these techniques, and this is, you can find similarities between the different authors and stuff like that, even though they have their specific styles.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate in the fact of my situation. I'm able to put 20 or 30 hours a week into
Mm.
doing this. And I just want to pass on that benefit as much as I'm able to. And yeah, on that note, I would say that, as I tell people, if you like the one-handed sword, that's great, but you can't learn the one-handed sword really fully by studying just the one-handed sword.
Mm.
You're not going to get really the context of their full message, because they didn't say everything that they knew when they were talking about the one-handed sword.
Yeah, so a great point, because you take a look at Marazzo, right? I mean,
Yes.
Marazzo's best advice for how he approaches the fight is in book 3 of the Two-Handed Sword. he scattered. I mean, he's Marazzo, right? So he just scatters his information all across his text. But
He does.
if you really want to find his best information on tactical information, right? Like Manciolino and the Anonimo give us phenomenal introductions that lay out their system, but
Mhm.
Marazzo just stuffs it in the back of book three for some
Yeah,
reason.
he doesn't quite care how he gets it to you, or that you notice it, or that you pick up on it. Um, you know, as he states, he's writing for son or people to refresh their memories, and he says, "You're not going to get this unless you've trained with me in person."
Hmm. Yeah.
An interesting thing, the same thing my Japanese teacher told me, 25 years ago. If you don't train with me in person, you're not going to get this stuff. And there's a great deal to be said about that. But unfortunately, we don't have him. We don't have Moroso to train with, and we have to do our best.
Yeah.
Right now, currently, where I'm going through the Sword and Targa material, and some of the best nuggets I've seen yet, I've pulled out of the Targa. Um, we are putting out some of the information on video for Targa now, even on YouTube, even for free. I don't. It doesn't bother me to give away things. This target material I've been working on now for, well, this is my second pass at it, meaning I've gone through everything of Morozzo's target material. He has two Assaulti, gone through it all over the past, say, 4 months. And now I'm completing a second cycle of it. And in the second cycle is when I'm recording it. And in addition to that, too, at the same time, going through Anonymous target material too, because to me that's very important to see the overlap of those two masters and seeing where I can fill in the gaps. Because just as I said, if you wanted to learn the one-handed sword, you can't just study the one-handed sword. I feel the same way about the masters themselves. If you want to study Marozzo, that's great, but you can't learn everything that Marozzo said by only reading Marozzo. You have to read everybody else.
To sort of build on that point a little bit, right? Like his the third book of the Sword and Small Buckler is where he gives his strata plays, and
Right,
he even introduces it as saying like this is good with single-edged weapons. So, or I mean
right.
single-handed edged weapons is what he says. So, it's like you have this. If you don't look at the full breadth of the material, you're always going to miss out on certain things. And
Yeah,
in the strata material, he says this is the core of the art. Like if you don't understand
yes.
this, then you might as well not even attempt to engage in the
That's where
fight.
the real fighting happens. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you think, well, I just want to do the one-handed sword, I want to do a buckler. Well, then you're winding up passing over that material, doing yourself a great disservice. That's would be my advice to anyone, really, more than anything, is don't neglect parts of the system that you find uninteresting
Yeah.
because missing the material.
Yeah. That's really great advice. So, because you do have this like output of all these different plays from all these different masters, you read all the books. Who's your favorite of all the
Ah,
four authors?
okay. Well, I'm gonna answer that. But first, I have to say I hate that question.
I know.
I hate that question because they all matter to me. They all help create this vision, this understanding that I have of them, and I'm grateful to have as many as we do have, and I would hate to lose even one of them. I think losing any one of them would be a tremendous loss. And my most honest answer is and don't have a favorite. And I know that sounds like skirting the question, but Morozzo, as we said, the breadth and the scope of his work, he's some people don't consider him eloquent. He may be a bit a bit crude at times with his verbiage, but I think he's very detailed. He never spares in detail, and I think for that we should be grateful. But the depth of his treatment and the breadth of his treatment, how many different weapons he doesn't really, there's nothing that he doesn't seem to touch in his material, and Manciolino, he's to me critically important for the way in which he represents the core theory. Now, to me, he does have very eloquent passages, but he can be a bit sparse. He can be a bit thin.
Hmm.
Sometimes he just says, uh, step forward and do this, and if he does that, you do this. I mean, he's very sparse with his details. So he, for me, was probably the hardest to work through in the beginning. Because of that fact, it took me a while to really understand his method of speech, his language, and um, the way to read him. It wasn't apparently immediately apparent.
Yeah.
Delagokia is wonderful in his structure, his organization. Really just want to know how to fence with a Bolognese one-handed sword. Really just look at Delagokia. His structure is well presented, exhaustive, complete. If that's your interest, that's a great place to be. Um, Anonimo, I view as really Anonimo fills in a lot of little gaps for me. I love his work. He's a bit idiosyncratic in a way, and some of his things seem a little more like he's doing things of his own. He's expressing himself. It's like to say, "This is my art. This is here's things I do," because they don't. Some of his things don't really line up with what
Right.
others do, and he's got his as far as structurally, you know, he'll be doing one set of material, and right in the middle of it, he'll just plop something else, and then
Yeah.
get back to where he was. It seems to me, and like for example, his material of two-handed sword, it seems like stuff was all handwritten, and he had his material and his two-handed material. Basically, some of that maybe fell out of the binder and got lost. It's like he meant to do that, but it just didn't. It didn't survive till our day. Possibly, his work seems unstructured, but still, despite that, incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Now,
I mean, it seems like when you have 400 some odd plays with a single-handed sword that you are definitely applying your
yeah,
own sort of like creative insight into the system. I agree.
yeah, he was just doing basically a dump of his mind
Yeah.
on, onto paper. Um, and or strikes me as a bit of a collector of techniques as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was also gathering information from whatever source he could. I get that feeling.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I kind of get the same thing. I mean, we don't really have a definitive date for the anonymous Bolognese.
Mhm.
And sometimes when you read it, it almost feels like you're reading a text that's written later. I know that right now it's attributed to being written sometime in the early 1500s, like 1510 or 16 or something like
Mhm.
that. But sometimes with some of the actions,
Yeah,
especially the sort of point forward nature, um, you just kind of get the feeling that there's a lot of sort of later
yeah.
Rapier-esque type of stuff. Like it's almost like he's responding to a very point forward system.
Yes, he does seem to foreshadow what's coming. So it seems to me that he falls uh, after Morozzo and Mancellino, possibly before Delagoquier, certainly published before Delagoquier did. But again, I've got there's no hard evidence of when he wrote what he wrote. His use of pole arms is interesting, and armor is interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's good stuff though. I mean,
Oh, it's absolutely great stuff. I
yeah,
recommend it. I recommend it to everybody.
yeah, just watch out for your feet and your groin.
Definitely do. And even Vigiani, while we're on the subject of the Masters, I know he intentionally veered away from what you could call the core, the tradition. saying that you people use outlandish names for your guards, and he's a reformer. He was his own teacher.
Yeah.
So it's important to view him in that context, but it's also, I think, important not to ignore him entirely. He existed in that place. He referenced the core tradition, and he has things to say about it. He has insights that we really don't get anywhere else on body mechanics,
Mhm.
some tactics, and I think it's important, even if now we don't actually approach his material at this point in time. He's a thing that we will approach Vigiani um, someday. You know, when I feel we've sufficiently expanded and explored what you call the core masters,
Yeah.
Moroso, Mancellino, um, Delagoche, and Anonimo. At some point, it'll be a project of ours to go through and say, here's what Vigiani said, here's what he did, and here's what it looks like, and here's how it's different. To me, that's more of a back burner project. I think still there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's my intention, it's my stated goal to practice and train and teach and record every play, every play of Marozzo, every play of Mancellino, every one of Delagoche, and really every one of Anonimo, believe it or not. I've got the time, I've got the will, I've got the great uh, backing of people I can work with, and we're going to get it done. Simply because I think it needs to be done, and that's in my opinion, in my see of getting the best grasp, the best understanding, the best comprehension of their intention of what they intended this stuff ought to be.
So let me rephrase the question. Let me rephrase it this way. Which of
Yes.
the four core masters do you see where perhaps do you feel most akin to in terms of how you sort of fence on your own? Like when you're fencing, do you
Mm.
feel like you your style lends more to Marazzo or Delagoche or the Anonimo?
That's a pretty good question, and it's still not an easy question. Um, Probably, I would draw from a sort of channel Delago
Mm.
simply because of the way his mind seems to work. It's kind of the way my mind would seem to work in the way of observation and judgment. And he seems very organized in the way he presents his material in sort of a if-then scenario. If you see this, then do that. My mind tends to work along uh, those structures. Um, as far as if I had to pick one, if you were to tell me, oh, you can only have one, I think I'd be forced to take Morozzo simply because of the breadth of his material and the fact that I want to keep my hand in all of those different weapons.
Yeah,
And, I would hate to just drop all of those things.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Mancellino teaches many of the same things in the same ways, and people have speculated that they even shared the same teacher. I have my reservations about saying that. I see a lot of differences between them as well. I don't see just similarities.
Mm.
I've been really picking through them tightly. I see differences, um, but obviously Mancellino's methodology of using a one-handed sword accompanied is a bit thin. There's not very much there to form a system around.
Yeah.
Marozzo has more in that regard. Even that, even the two of them together, wouldn't satisfy really the need of creating an entire system around that one weapon.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's almost like the anonymous two-handed sword where you just have like maybe Manciolino lost his notes too. Because it's all from Porta de Ferro Stretta, and that's kind of what we
Right.
get with the Anonymous's two-handed sword.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna skip ahead here because I think that you
Okay.
like more weapons, and that was a question that I was gonna ask is what is your favorite weapon? But I don't. I have a feeling that you're gonna tell me you don't have one.
I think you're gonna, yeah, I think you're gonna get.
So I'm gonna go ahead and skip ahead here,
Well,
and
let me just say one thing.
sure.
My Japanese teacher told me years ago. He said, if anyone ever asks you what your favorite weapon is or your favorite technique is, watch out, because if you tell them, you watch out because now that person can kill you.
That's that's great advice. Yeah, I mean, well, and that's actually really fascinating from a historical context too. From even in the Bolognese system, like Manciolino's advice on how to conduct a duel at the end of his introduction, he gives a lot of advice about choosing weapons based on the height of a person, based on the strength of the person, based on what they prefer. Like if you know that they prefer a specific weapon, then you go for something else.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we even see that reflected, here in the Bolognese tradition. So it's
Yeah.
really fascinating.
My best answer is I would have to say that I don't have a preference because I don't um, I don't want to feel that there's anything that I'm equally good at. I want to feel that I'm equally good at all things. I don't want to have a favorite. I don't want to favor a weapon in the same sense that there's nothing that I dislike. Be able to feel that I can pick up anything and use it. I can pick up anything and teach it because it's part of our style.
Yeah. So because you do have such a great depth of catalog, what are some of the challenges that you've faced developing your interpretations and from the treatises, and how have you overcome them?
Well, I think the biggest one is understanding the role of provocations in the art
Hmm.
because they do make a big deal about saying don't attack somebody who's in old guard um, with an attempt to wound, as Delagoke so eloquently puts that.
Yeah,
They all say it in their own way, but there's a sort of an assumption after that that you have to watch out for. So in the beginning of my own journey, in these texts, and it says that, oh, you should hit your strike your opponent with a mandrito to the head. You know, be careful about that because they just told you don't attack somebody settled in a guard with an attempt to wound. And here now they say, well, okay, he's in this guard, hit him in the head with a mandrito. Well, wait a minute, you just told me not to do that. I mean, not to attack somebody who's in a settled guard, earnest attack, and understanding really what they mean here is they're talking about provocations, and that's not always obvious. Um,
yeah, and to that point, yeah, thinking about like Maranzo with his provocations, if you look at the sword and dagger material, two-handed sword material, when he actually does tell you to attack, most of the time, the common theme for Marazzo, as he's telling you to attack throughout his treatise, is to essentially throw a falso to the hand until they respond, and then you come in. But if you look at the rest of his material, most of the time it's this is how you defend a mandrito, this is how you defend a reverso, this is how you defend a reverso to the leg. But his common theme that seems to exist throughout his system is attacking with that falso to the hand.
yeah, it's to draw out a response. It's not to draw blood. It's not to wound. Um, if you look at, it's, like I mentioned in the beginning, that really kind of slowed me down. My first few years, I thought that I was supposed to be attacking the body of my opponent, which puts me in a different position. Closer, it puts me a lot more at risk, and it seemed at odds with their their advice and with things that I began to read as I began to look at the entire system, as I began to read everything that everybody wrote. This idea that we just charge in on somebody and attack them, that began to be a problem, and I it began to dawn on me. It began to unfold after the first couple of years. Well, we shouldn't be doing that. That really, if you look at what they say to do, what they really say to do. They say commonly wait and let your opponent be the first to attack. They do say that. Uh, you know, if you don't want to be the first to attack, if you don't want to be the, or if you want to be the first to attack, we do. We throw a provocation to draw out a response, a provocation to create an invitation. We throw out a provocation to expose something that we can strike or to get somebody to attack us. Uh, so even though we can at times be the first person to throw something, we can be the agent, we're still creating a situation in which we're making the other person be the first to commit to an earnest attack, an attack to wound. I find this to be very common. Um, in addition to that, we also use beats
Hmm.
instead of the case of us starting at some settled guard, attacking somebody else in some other settled guard with an intent to wound as the first thing that we do is an incredibly rare thing. You'd be hard pressed to find that. And so letting this understanding guide you through these plays, I think is an important revelation to me. And it's one of, I would say the thing that's the most significant um, in my own development of my interpretations, because that understanding impacts everything: measure, timing, targeting.
Yeah, and I think so this kind of ties into something that I had as a later question, but I think it's important. I think it's a good segue. I think that provocations really do kind of develop the core of the tactical and strategic mindset of the Bolognese system. I think this is emphasized in the Anonymous general advice when he says, also, you must know that if you find your enemy in a wide guard, then you will use your art to bring his sword into presence. If he has his sword in presence, then you must, by means of feinting, make him put his sword into a wide guard that allows you to control the line. I mean, that could be through anything. He says that can be done through feints or, of course, beating the sword and stuff like that. And then he concludes with such that this sword will point away from your person and off to the side of your body, and you will then be able to perform whatever action you wish.
Mm.
Um, and then, so like in the lead up to our conversation, I was actually watching one of the videos of you doing jujitsu, and um, I thought it was really interesting because there was one action that you were doing in the form that you were presenting, and you gave the opponent the same, essentially, like, you attacked them the same way 3 times. Using Bolognese terms, you gave them a mandrito 3 times, but then
Right,
they
right.
respond to the mandrito, and then you attack on the other side. Um, and I found that fascinating because there's this one verse in Manciolino that I've kind of been obsessing over lately, and it's he actually gives the exact same advice, and it's about conditioning your opponent, right? So
Right.
there's so many different ways to provoke. You can provoke with tempo, with measure, but provoking with conditioning your opponent to give them an action that you want, I think sometimes is something that we really miss out on. And this one's, I think, is really interesting. He says, if you're trying to make the opponent deliver an attack in order to strike him within the same tempo, you should yourself deliver the same attack 3 or 4 times in a row, almost as an invitation. It is common amongst fencers to ape one another. So your opponent will see himself compelled to eventually do the same to you. And in that moment, you will perform the attack as planned.
Yeah.
So there's so many of these interesting sort of similarities and
Right.
things that really kind of flush out the system.
Yeah, yeah. That he gave there as sort of general advice is explicitly detailed out in several plays where you will throw a falso to the hand. Let's say, do this 2 times, yeah, so the conditioning aspect is absolutely a tool that we can use, and it's an interesting tool in terms of our strategic and tactical approach. I would say to explore this idea that we have a defensive approach, that this is a defensive art. As they constantly said, wait to make your opponent be the first to attack. How many times did they ever say that? Hundreds of times,
Yeah.
seems like. And when you don't want to wait, and you want to be the first to attack, um, like I said, we don't normally make an attempt to wound somebody, but we still attempt to draw out a response, even an attack from our opponent, to where we'll throw a few cuts as provocations that um, may not even land, may not even be intended to land, but we place ourselves in a position of vulnerability, you know, Chinchilla Porta de Ferro or Porta Ferro Larga or some such, where we're still trying to get the other person to commit um, before we do. So I would say, um, and it's not doesn't it, and it doesn't work so well maybe in a sporting environment because you don't really score a lot of points being defensive. So I
Yeah.
look at this idea, approach it from what they said is that well we're doing a defensive art, and you can see that through, throughout their writings.
Yeah, well, I think that that's sort of the virtue of provocations, even something like conditioning, um, is in a sporting setting, if you do end up fighting, because I mean, there is advice for what to do if your opponent doesn't really want to engage, and
Right,
oftentimes the time that you do have to be the first one to act is when your opponent doesn't want to engage. And so that's where provocations really become valuable, is
exactly.
trying to get that person out of whatever defensive guard they're in. You're trying to
Yeah,
move them from their set position, just like the anonymous was saying, so that way you can sort of press in and sort of press
right,
the attack.
right.
Where,
Yeah, you can't
yeah,
wait forever if they're not going to attack.
yeah. And if they do come in, they really come in hot at you, and they're like, I'm gonna hit this guy, then we have such a breadth of defensive techniques that we you really can kind of pick and choose and decide
Right.
which one really kind of fits the situation that you're in.
Yeah,
um
yeah. And I like this statement, and I can't recall which author said it, that it takes more skill to defend yourself, to be skillful at defense skill than does offense.
yeah,
Teach
Delagokius says that
anybody,
in his
yeah,
introduction. Yep.
yeah. You can teach anybody to attack, but to properly defend yourself takes more skill.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that does require probably maybe the bulk or maybe more more of a percentage of your time spent in being good at defense.
But it's also, I find it really interesting and quite amazing that the very nature of provocations, no matter how you approach them, if you're using measure or tempo or changing guards, whatever you're doing to try to provoke your opponent to attack you, or even giving them a feint, or conditioning, the
Mm,
core concept of a provocation is you're creating a predictable response from your opponent. if
exactly.
i if I know that you're in a specific guard, let's say you're in coda longa stretta, and I thrust a punta reversa at you, you really only have a limited number of things that you can do from that position. You have to set my
Right.
sword offline, and then
Yeah.
whatever attack you give, I know is
Yeah.
predictable from there. And then I can
Yeah.
go into my defensive set, and that's
Right.
where I gain the advantage.
Right.
So,
Because it's not wise if you're the patient there. Just yeah, as you say, there's only a certain number of movements that are wise to make.
so what is something that you think that we as a Bolognese community can do to improve upon the better reflect the sources in our fencing?
Um, I would say, as I've already stated, with as many of them as you can, as fully as you can. Um, don't try to have favorites. But if you've not tried something, if you've never picked up a partisan, I would say pick up a partisan. If you've never picked up a poleaxe, if you've never done the dagger grappling plays of Morozzo, I'd highly recommend that. I really think, I approach this as a martial art. I really want to know the minds of the people who wrote this stuff down when their lives depended on what they did. I want to know their minds. And um, to me, the dagger grappling material of Marozzo is quite an important bit of material. It reflects the times, it reflects their mindset. Um, and so I would say if you've never done that before, definitely pick that up. If you've never done buckler or even targa is a wonderful implement. And just because you've done the buckler material, don't assume that you know the targa. They are actually not identical. Um, so targa is actually a load of fun and should be studied. I would say pick something that you've never done and work it. Don't let any sort of previous experience be a roadblock uh, to exploring all that the Bolognese system has to offer. Um, and one more thing I would say is don't rush to form an interpretation or an opinion. These things take time. Don't sit down on a weekend and hammer out all of your opinions and stick to them. Be flexible and understand that your understanding of these things takes time. We don't have teachers as we did in Japanese or Chinese or some other form of martial art. We don't have a direct lineage of people who have had this stuff transmitted to them back from the day when they used it for real. We have a broken lineage. And so for us, it is going to take longer. It is going to be frustrating. It is going to feel like um, we are attempting to cobble together this thing, and we will encounter difficulties. And it's important for us to be patient and not to insist that we have an answer right now for all these questions. I think that in time we will arrive at very satisfactory answers to the questions of what does this stuff look like. It's one thing to read a translation, and our translators do a great job at um, presenting their words to us. But what something looks like on paper in a book as a translation, that really doesn't tell you what it looks like in action, in person. To have something written on paper, there's still this question, well, what does it really look like? I see it here, but what is it when you do it? And so I think we will eventually arrive at very satisfactory answers to that. Um, but it's not going to be a quick process, and we need to accept that and be prepared for that, and not, as I say, rush to our interpretations and cling to them, and work with each other. I'm got my interpretations, but I also be the first to tell you I'm ready to modify them at the drop of a hat. If I come across information in a section of a book of a Bolognese master that I haven't read before and it contradicts what I thought, I created an interpretation, I will rework my interpretation.
Hmm.
I am definitely not set in stone um, with what I think about this stuff. I do um, have a I have a pretty good setup and I have a pretty good system and I have these things organized and recorded very very thoroughly and described in a lot of detail. But that doesn't mean that I'm unwilling to modify them, especially in light of new information, especially when it comes from a Bolognese source.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing advice. I love that because, I think that one of the cores of martial arts in general doesn't matter, where it comes from, is always being willing to learn and to listen.
Mhm.
And I feel like that when you stop listening and you stop trying to learn and you get conceited and you feel like you know all the answers is when things pass you by, or you end up running into somebody who really has put the time in, and that's the biggest thing too. And of course, you have that gift that you have that time, and that's why you're such a valuable resource, and the fact that you're willing to share that with us for free um, is amazing. But if anybody is interested in signing up for Ken's Patreon, look up the St. Louis School of Arms on Patreon, and support him, because it is important for us to keep people like Ken going. So
Thank you.
with that, Ken, I am, of course, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to hopefully getting an opportunity to see you again, and training with you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Our doors are always open, and we like visitors, and we like to have a good time and meet new friends.
All right. Well, Ken, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that concludes Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. I'd like to thank our guest, Ken Harding, again for coming on and sharing his wisdom with us. Next week, we're going to be interviewing Stephen Fratis, the translator of the Anonymous Bolognese, with Malice and Cunning, anonymous 16th century manuscript on Bolognese swordsmanship. So please tune in, and don't forget to like and subscribe.